This episode is being brought to you in part by Real-Time CTMS, a leading provider of innovative software solutions for clinical trial research sites, site networks, sponsors, and CROs. To get a free demo, visit the company's website at realtime-ctms.com and complete one of their contact forms. Hello and welcome to the Note to File podcast, a collection of interviews, best practices, and candid commentary for clinical research sites. I'm your host, Brad Hightower. Our guest this week is Joe Dustin. Joe's the Vice President of Product Strategy and General Manager for eCOA and Decentralized trials at Medable. He's responsible for the go-to-market strategy around Medable's solutions and is working to define what decentralized trials will become with the professionals who are living it every day. For 20 years, Joe's been in the clinical trials industry at the intersection of technology, innovation, and science. He's held a number of roles in IT, project management, solution consulting, product development, and sales at tech companies like Medidata and CRF Health, and was most recently the head of clinical innovation and change management at Bristol Myers Squibb. In this episode, we really cover so many topics, but we talk about decentralized trials, shockingly, the financial implications for sites, the existing disconnect between sponsor, vendor, and site, the value proposition of site-led technology, and really so much more. Also, I want to encourage you guys to stay tuned. I'm going to have Joe come do a LinkedIn Live on September 1st, sort of a follow-up to the podcast. There's a lot we didn't get to cover here, so stay tuned for that. Without further ado, Joe Dustin.
All right, Joe Dustin. Appreciate you coming on, man. This is exciting and a long time coming.
It's a day in the making, Brad. Great to see you. Great to hear you.
Absolutely. I'm going to, start out same as I do with everybody else. I know you're no spring chicken in the clinical trial world. So tell us a little bit about your background, kind of bring us up to where you are today. Let's hear your backstory, man.
Wow. So thanks for having me on today. My name is Joe Dustin. I've been in the clinical trials world for 20 years. This year, actually, it feels like forever ago, but
and you're only 30 years old, so
exactly at 31, really. And I fell into the industry. I'm going to date myself now. I fell into the industry right out of college, and like most people, by accident. And I've mostly been in the eClinical technology world with a stint in pharma for a little while as well. Today, I am the VP of Product Strategy and General Manager of eCOA at Medable. But I wouldn't be there today if it wasn't for sort of the experiences and what I went through in the past 20 years to kind of bring this pedigree of experiences together to try and make a difference in our industry. Like I said, I fell into this industry by accident. I met a guy at a family barbecue. It was 2002. I'm just getting out of college. Again, dating myself. And the house that my mom grew up in, Italian grandfather, the typical dug the basement out with his bare shovel type thing. They all lived in a 3-family house in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And my mom was the only one that moved out. The other sisters lived until my grandfather died, as you would, because you're Italian. But my mom rented the second floor, and she never lived there. So she's smart. and she rented it to this Finnish couple from Finland. And at a family barbecue, I was just about to graduate. And he's like, we could use an IT guy. Why don't you come and interview with us? And so I did. Graduated. And in the summertime, I went and interviewed. And I ended up getting the job as an IT guy at a small little startup called CRF Box, which became CRF Health, which became Cigna Health eventually back in the day. So the dawn of ePro, building these things on Palm Pilots. And at the time, deploying these things to some of the biggest deployments we had. I remember over Thanksgiving of 2002 was, 2,000 patients in 18 countries and 25 languages for the biggest, at the time, phase 3 trial for a drug. I think it was an irritable bowel syndrome study that was first time not using paper to determine their primary outcomes. So it was a big deal. So I saw that. I was an IT guy turned project manager, turned support, device, logistics, all that, right? So I did the ePro thing for about 6 years. I went from CRF to a company called eTrials that then became IBM's clinical development group over time as they got acquired and went out. And then I went and spent 12 years at Medidata, where we took electronic data capture from a single app to a platform. And I'm sure you've used Medidata at some point in your site world, right?
Still have a lot of studies on Rave for sure.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's the leading tool right now for that. But we grew it to a platform. I had a number of roles there, from solution consulting to sales to product. And it was an amazing experience to go from pre-IPO to post-acquisition, and really kind of helped me get closer to clients in that particular case, do a lot of change management type activities from the perspective of the tech vendor, if you will, and really helped propel digital transformation within pharma just from the technology side and getting closer to clients. And it was at that point, COVID hit, the world changed. And honestly, I'd done kind of everything I wanted to do at Medidata. And I got a call from some friends at Bristol Myers Squibb and said, would you be interested in this role to be the head of clinical innovation and change management? And it was something I always wanted to do, was to be the client for a little while and learn what it was like from the inside of pharma. And bringing all my tech experience, I would think that I could be a voice of something different to bring it into this kind of role. And if you're the innovation person, hopefully I want to go there and go break stuff and make it work better and bring another perspective. And at least, find the things you can break safely, but sometimes, because you have to break them and then figure out what you can instill new. So I was excited to do that. And so I resigned from Medidata. Actually, I called, the first person I called was Glenn DeVries, who sadly is no longer with us anymore, but he was super excited people would all move on to the industry. We kind of all knew that everybody that was in this world that sort of grew up around the eClinical technology paradigm that just grew over these 12 years, we'd all go off and do something great eventually, right? And many have. And so I went to pharma and was there for about a year and a half. And then I just got I got a little FOMO from the tech side. And I've known the folks at Medable since about 2015, and had breakfast one morning, and it kind of went from there. And so now, so I fell into the clinical trial world by accident. I fell in on the tech side. I saw the move from paper to electronic. I've never run a clinical trial on paper in my life. I've never been involved with one. And so I kind of have this different perspective on where things are. But that's kind of how I started. And at Medable now, I'm working on what the future of decentralized trials should be and maybe will be. I think we have an opinion that's similar or maybe different to many others, but I think this is very similar to the rise of ePro in the early 2000s and the rise of EDC in the 2000s to 2016 or so. It's like we're playing deja vu all over again. It's a very similar perspective that we're going through these 10-year cycles of digital transformation. We have to figure out who it affects. It affects sponsor companies, sites. It affects patients. It affects the CROs, everybody, right? And this doesn't happen every 1-2 years, happens every 10 years. And we're going through it again right now. And I'm pretty excited to help define what that will look like. And no doubt we'll have some bumps along the way, but that's how it happens. That's how you get it right. You have to try things out and then get feedback from the people that use it, which is why I'm really excited to talk to you, because I think that we should dispel some myths out there when it comes to decentralized trials, that the sites can't be ignored or forgotten about in this way. And I've seen a lot of what is being discussed in social media platforms, like LinkedIn. You're pretty active on LinkedIn. That's how I met you first. And in the market, I think that it's not just being patient-centric. We have to be site-centric, and there are ways we can make that experience better. So I am in the middle of that. I'm a fan of you. I'm a fan of trying to figure out how the sites can be an equal partner in this to just make research better so we can get treatments out faster, and everybody in the chain would benefit.
Yeah, well, I mean, you could say, and I've been on the site side my whole career. It's been, I'm creeping up on 15 years. So it's this is kind of a new experience even for me to see such an influx of I guess change all here at the same time, right? And for sites, I think it's extra confusing because so much is not clear yet as to like what does DCT mean. It's sort of like vaguely defined in some ways, and how. It's not clear yet how it's going to sort of blow back. But, if you go to LinkedIn and you scroll through, you can't, make it 20 seconds without seeing how DCT is a huge disruption. It's going to fix diversity. We're going to enroll more patients. It's going to make everyone's lives better. And, is it? Are we there? Will we be there? It's sort of a cut through the smoke, right? Like, where are we and where do sites stand? And again, what's true and what's just BS? It's still difficult to say. Mm-hmm. Wouldn't you agree at this point?
No, I would definitely agree. But I will say a couple things, well, maybe more than a couple things, but I'll try and summarize it. This is definitely a situation of, see if I can get this reference right. All waves rise, all boats. Is that the right thing?
A rising tide
lifts all boats.
Lifts all ships.
Okay.
Right.
So rising tide lifts all ships, which means there's a lot of companies that are trying to figure out what decentralized trials will become. Many of them have a lot. I mean, it's in 2014, the buzzword was M-Health. Now it's decentralized trials, right? So It moves. So I think that there's a lot of companies, and then again, the deja vu thing, right? This is where I think it's going. And whether you're an analyst financially, or you're a CEO, or you're someone just working in this scene, trying to see where it goes, where your career goes, the way I see it is in the next 3 to 5 years, there's going to be some clear leaders. There's some clear leaders now, and you see analyst reports that show that. But over time, these companies will consolidate. There will be acquisitions and M&A done, and there will be new products that will grow. So some will grow by acquisition, some will grow organically, some will do both. And then eventually in the next 8 years, you'll have some clear 2 to 3 leaders, and everybody else is sort of supporting. But there's so many new capabilities that just didn't exist before, that they have standalone companies that just do this one thing. And you're like, well, now I got a new login. Now I have a whole bunch of new things, but it's solving a problem that didn't exist, right? And so those things have to consolidate eventually, is what will happen. And this is what happened from 2008 to 2016 when EDC became more than EDC, right? And all these things became a platform. Although I don't think decentralized trials will follow the same road. I don't think it'll be the next unified platform for research. I think right now, if you were to talk to pharma companies, and right now I would say the majority of the large pharma companies are the ones that are figuring this out. So if you're a site and you're doing a contract to participate in a clinical trial with some pharma company, or a CRO working with some pharma company, many of them are trying to figure out ways to decentralize the process and what that means. So you're probably seeing a bunch more vendors involved. You're probably seeing a lot more process that may complicate your life. But in that way, they're trying to, the box in pharma of where DCT fits is really around unifying the patient experience. That's what most of them think right now. And it isn't where it stops, but that's where it starts. And so the patient experience, what's the first thing they have in their hand right now mostly? It's ePro, it's eCOA. It's patient-reported outcomes on a mobile phone, whether it's a phone that's provisioned to them or that they use their own, right? And then now that they have that thing in their pocket, what else can we do with it to unify the experience? How do we add better engagement? How do we do televisits? How do we push consents to them at the beginning of the trial, during the trial when you have to reconsent? How do we give the patients optionality to how they want to participate? I don't want to come to the site to pick up the next supply of drugs. Can you ship it to my house? Click. Here's my thing. I want to pay the patients. There's a digital card in the app. Like there's things like that. All these things meaning like if I'm thinking about the way Medable is positioning and the way sponsors are seeing us and probably others, they say there might be a lot of vendors out there. We want it all to flow through this DCT box because that would own the patient experience. And that's not the case all today, but I think that's where it's going.
Yeah, that's fair. Because again, I think as a site, when you look at the landscape, you see, to your point, you see 100 new vendors all of a sudden.
Yeah.
Right. And again, some maybe are related or connected in some ways, some aren't. Again, as you allude to, we're seeing a lot more vendors in our studies. Where there's there's home health now. There's all these different things being sort of thrown in. And again, for sites, it's still confusing, right? How much does this? I mean, let's be really honest. How much does this take out of the pockets of the site if things are moving away from happening at the site? And if sites are losing out on potential revenue, can that be made up by the ability to increase volume, reach more patients? And that's not clear to sites yet, I think. So, of course, even though, of course, we all want what's best for patients, it's still, that can still be potentially a challenge for sites that are already not exactly, swimming in money like Scrooge McDuck,
Right.
There's, sites are often struggling.
I still don't know when Scrooge McDuck would dive into his tower of coins. He didn't just fall face plant and crush his skull, but I guess it's because it's a cartoon. I was wondering the physics on that one.
Right.
Maybe that's why he's rich.
Yeah, he's got it figured out. He's got some access to some technology we don't know about.
For sure.
So yeah, I think that, again, that puts sites in a weird spot, and they haven't really historically been a real big part of the conversation. I mean, living in the world where patient is the end user, so to speak, but sponsor is sort of the buyer, and site is somewhere in between where they're neither really considered the user or the buyer. You know what I'm saying? So again, I think we're seeing a shift in the paradigm, but is it going to continue to push sites further to the margin, or is it going to bring them into the fold a little bit more?
I find it interesting of how so it has to be a viable business model to work across the different stakeholders that are involved. But our industry is strange for a number of reasons, but strange in the way the business model works, because when it comes to technology, in the consumer world, you have the end user, which is typically the one buying it or the one using it and the one that you can get the feedback from and immediately iterate. So in the agile world of technology development, let me give you an example. Clubhouse. I think you and I first saw you on Clubhouse, and I saw you on LinkedIn and connected the dots. So I haven't used Clubhouse really since the lockdowns. Every Friday, every now and then, I pop on to some things. But sure. That app, when it first started, did not have many features, but it was just very basic, and people got in there. And I went into it after not going in there for like 9 months. There's been so much added because the users were like, this is how we would use this. We never had this thing before. And now they finally have like the backroom chats. They have the story things at the top. They have the ability to record your sessions. These are all coming from problem statements that were properly articulated. The product managers listened, they grew the company. And that's how technology development should go. And I will say, at Medable, we have a lot of tech heavy people at the company. The development teams, they all come from Silicon Valley. They all understand that kind of world. And then we have a lot of other people that are not from Silicon Valley, that are from industry. And that pedigree together is very important to say, well, we know the best of tech, we know the best of the industry, then you have to guide each other, right? Without the other one, then you're building stuff. If you're in a regulated world, you don't understand it, then you build the wrong things and no one will use it. But if you don't have, they have to be in unison, because the buyer, the user, and the people who fund it are like sometimes three different people.
Right.
Could be the buyer's the sponsor, the buyer's the CRO, the sponsor is the funder, and the user is the sites and the patients, and they're all different, right? And so you have different personas you have to keep in touch, but the buyer always ends up getting the features they want and everybody else gets left behind. Hence why the site experience, I would say, is a problem right now. And I mean, I know where I am, we're taking that very seriously on how to fix the site experience, but not everybody is, right? And similar to when EDC rose up in the early days, the site experience was a thick client PDF in a web browser.
Right.
And that didn't work, right? Or shipping laptops to sites, right? Like that didn't work. And so the site experience got better with better web-based EDC and zero footprint, browser independent, And those little things were what made all the difference. So now we're going through what's the next iteration of how the site experience gets better with what decentralized trials will become. And I think a lot of it is understanding a lot of problems they've already had for years, but finally really listening in a different way. For example, how could sponsors and sites become more interoperable together so that if sites have technology that they've already spent money on, time on, with process and ways to make your life easier, like to do more with less staff and to take out the admin work, and to how can you just use your systems and pass that to the sponsor in ways that they would accept? You're one of those people that have systems internally. I think was it real-time CTMS is one of your sponsors? That's what you use? That's your thing?
Yeah.
No affiliation, but a good system. I like it, right?
Yeah.
And why can't sponsors accept them? That's a digital system. You're not using paper. And you can get documents online. You can give access to audit-trailed Part 11 compliant data that's almost like a CRF, but it's source data. Why can't they just pull from that? And the answer is they don't know how, and they can't do it because not every single site in their 100-site study knows how to do that. And so it's one size fits all or nothing.
Well, and that's sort of it adds another, there's a lot of layers to that, right? So one is, are we just at sort of the point now where there's not enough consolidation that we can sort of all get on the same page, or is the future more in interoperability via, APIs? So I guess I feel like the future could go one of two ways. It could be that, sites love to be like, we do things this way. And sponsors like to be like, no, you're going to do things this way. So does that lean towards a future where APIs solve the problem so everybody can use their own thing and everything talks to each other? Or do we just see a time when there's enough consolidation to where there's not 7 different eSource platforms, there's just a couple different direct data capture companies instead? And I mean, does that make sense? Does one of those two futures seem more likely than the other?
It totally makes sense. So aside from my day job at Medable, I've been an eSource champion for about 10 years to try and figure out how to get to that place where sites can digitally transform themselves because they have to, and the economics work, and that it's interoperable enough that sponsors can pull from it and CRAs and CROs can get to the data, and the vendors all play happy together in like a marketplace type thing. That has not happened, partially because of the business model I mentioned earlier, because the buyers and the users are not the same. So now you find people trying to get sites to adopt tools for free, and the sponsors will pay for it somewhere, which is non-traditional, but I think it's a good attempt. I think that you'll see more of that, right?
Yeah.
I don't also, well, in the beginning, I thought that sites had to do it themselves because they have to be the owners of the data and control the data. And some of the guidances and eSource guidances, especially when they go to the Europeans, they take it very conservatively to the letter of the guidance and say, we must control this in our walls, in a box in the closet. So we have control over the data, and the sponsor cannot have control of the data. So the sponsor is giving them the system. That doesn't necessarily mean they have control of the data, because there's permissions and logical stuff in there that protects that. So I do think that the way that the regulations are interpreted sometimes can be the problem. But also, I don't think that the site has to be the owner of the system. So does that mean that sponsors are going to now start deploying eSource systems and not EDC systems anymore? And then if they deploy an eSource system to you, you're going to say, I already have an eSource system, I want to use mine. Or if you don't have anything, well, that means I can use it for your study. What about the rest of my studies? How does that help me? These questions are the ones we should be asking now to help sites. And I think there could be incentives. The federal government could help. That's a whole nother topic. But like we gave out money for EHRs in the Obama administration, there could be money out for research. The 21st Century Cures Act is asking this year for recommendations from industry on what incentives could be given to increase the adoption of decentralized trials and improve clinical trial diversity. There's a lot of things on the table that could be that.
Yeah, that's true.
It could, and then that could cascade. So a pharma CEO might get some incentive that, makes them X amount of $1 billion on their commercialized drug if they can get it there faster, or their diversity numbers get up. So then it cascades 5 levels down and says, figure out how to get there. And if that means,
right.
So that's kind of where it goes.
Yeah, I mean, as it stands, I think it's an interesting issue for sites, right? Because I have the ability to do and manage my own eSource. But the problem is, it's not, if anything, it's a more financial burden because I have to pay for it. Really, there aren't many sponsors that are willing to fully comp that cost. Maybe you can find it and make it up somewhere in your budget, but it's generally not set aside because, again, for them, they can't necessarily, doesn't save them time per se, especially since they're still sending CRAs on site to do source data verification. So also, maybe that's another topic for, further down the road here.
It's madness.
And then again, even if I go through the trouble of building eSource myself, I still have to go put it in EDC. It's not saving me any time either. So at this point, it's very hard to find a strong incentive for sites to move to eSource, I think, even though I do think ultimately it's what we should be doing, right? But again, we're not really incentivizing sites to do that.
Do you think that sites should be paid by sponsors for their own infrastructure?
That's a good question.
I don't think sponsors would agree.
No, probably not. But again, if sites have to develop source based off of what the sponsor is giving them, because that's what they want, right? So to some degree, I'm having to do the work for you. I'm doing the work for you. I'm not doing it for any other reason than for your project, right?
Right.
So it's still a pretty direct cost. And again, what if I could save you thousands in airplane trips from your CRA because you can have access to my eSource at any time, 24 hours a day?
I think that would be one of the value props that have to be given out there. I think there's a problem in a couple areas, right? Some sites say they won't invest in eSource because they don't have a guarantee or are not convinced that sponsors will even accept it. So there's one. But then there's another side of it, like, it will help you independently even if a sponsor doesn't accept it right away, yes, you might still have to do some of the other work, but in theory, it should automate a lot of tasks internally for you as a business.
That is true.
So it starts there, right? So you have to have incentives on your own to get to eSource because it helps you. And then as a side benefit, you go to industry and say, I'm an eSource enabled site. I can get you data faster. I can,
Yeah.
And then the real trick is, how does that work in the budgets and the contracts that you work on, right? Does that mean they're going to give you less money, or are you more valuable because you can give it to them faster and less data problems? Because that's what they care about, right?
Sure.
And there is no database yet of eSource enabled clinical sites. Transcelerate won't put one out because they're worried that would be like an antitrust thing and be negative to sites that don't have it, which they shouldn't be left out because they don't have it, because they have, right? They shouldn't do that. But sponsors want to know, where are they? Right. And many of the bigger sites, the big academic centers and health systems and whatnot, many of them have their own massive IT departments and budgets, and the smaller ones are starting to, I think, rise up. Do you see a trend of sites trying to digitally enable themselves more now post-COVID?
I think so, yeah. But I mean, to sort of, if I can go back to your other point, I mean, study sponsors will ask, about eSource as an option, but I've never had a single sponsor care whether we use eSource or not, or paper. So again, it's sort of, I get you're saying, like, maybe for sites, it's an inherently good business practice, so they should do it anyway. But again, I still think that's going to be a challenge for, especially smaller sites that don't, I mean, again, yeah, a big academic medical center has got a huge department dedicated to IT infrastructure. Sure, I'm a 10-person company that's bootstrapped, and just trying to keep patients rolling through the door. It's more challenging, I think, based off your different site models, right?
Yeah, I think for your listeners, so they're aware, there is a number of initiatives going on that is trying to converge the world of research and healthcare. It has a lot of involvement from a number. It's the first initiative I've seen that has involvement not just from sponsors, but from academic sites, from regulators, from tech vendors, and they're all like in the same space. And it's run kind of by HL7, which is the medical record standard to transport data. Mm-hmm. And it's called Project Vulcan, which is awesome in itself. But it is meant to figure out ways to eventually test out ideas to make eSource work and go back to HL7 and make those FHIR resources that are interoperable with health records more clinical trial intelligent, so that the integrations become easy. Why do you think Google now all of a sudden can, in certain areas, offer you the ability to schedule a doctor's visit through a Google search like you would a restaurant reservation? Because these APIs have matured, and what they call the FHIR 4.0 standard, anyone who's one of your listeners on a site that has an EMR will know what this is. It's required to have that up and running by the end of this year. You're going to get penalized by the government. And so as a result of that interoperability standard now becoming the major standard in the US and everyone is forced to have it, new things get to happen. The real world data companies are now going around and pulling tons of data now to be able to offer you value by organizing your data in new ways, but also giving it back to sponsors for recruitment purposes and long-term follow-up purposes and tokenizing the data and things like that. But it's easier now to do that now that the standards are there. And so there's this value chain where you get something, but then other parts of the marketplace get other value as well. And then the circle of life sort of, this is a major improvement for interoperability in our world, this specifically.
Yeah, I don't know how I've not heard of that. Project Vulcan? I need to do some reading up on that.
Yeah. And so there are the sites involved are mostly the big academic centers, because I would say a lot of sites that are smaller don't have a medical record system, so that doesn't really apply to them. So the smaller sites that are either dedicated research sites, which I believe, according to SCRS, is still about 1/3 of all clinical research sites in the world. If there's 75,000 sites in the world, by the way, that number is pre-COVID. I don't know how many we lost.
Sure.
And that's inclusive of site networks and whatnot. 1/3 of them are not academic centers and hospitals and big, huge things. And so most of those probably don't have a medical record. Most of those will be game for an eSource direct data capture system to manage a CTMS to manage the clinical trials, right?
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, do you think that shifts with the rise of DCT? Like, do you think the site sort of model starts to shift? Because again, now we're looking at a whole different paradigm potentially, right?
I think it does. And I think that the definition of a site changes. So you remember, and probably some of you and listeners probably have this mindset, like this mental trigger in the back of their mind that decentralized trials, or virtual trials as they first were called, means like the end of sites. And we found out that is not at all true. There were some companies that started to pioneer that, and that was kind of the message. They've all kind of changed tune. The hybrid way is the way to go. But even today, some sites think that, my role will be diminished. I argue that we're going to double the amount of sites that we have in our trials, but what they are will be different. A site is no longer just Hightower Clinical or UCSF or Sloan Kettering. It's going to be CVS. It's going to be the church down here. It's going to be your doctor, right? So there'll be mini sites. More of them. So if you have a 100-site clinical trial, you might have 300 sites, but they're way smaller. They're associated with more master sites, child sites, and they're organized in new ways. That's what we haven't figured out yet of how that works at scale.
That's interesting. That's interesting. Well, and even now, I think it's muddy, right? Like, I call my sites Hightower Clinical, but like, I've got a standalone site. I'm integrated within a bunch of clinics. I'm in a hospital system, and they're all, what's a site and what's not a site, right? It does get a little bit muddy, but like to your point, there's a whole, I'm with you. I think diminish maybe not be the right word, but I think there could be a shift in how sites operate simply because maybe, the traditional needs of a site are different. They're different, right? Maybe it does become more tech heavy or more customer service oriented and less clinical, perhaps. I mean, I think there's certainly a lot of possibilities as what happens where changes, to your point. I mean, optionality, right? I mean, you don't necessarily need everyone to be a nurse always on staff anymore, perhaps.
This is where I see the future of decentralized trials going, at least in the short term. There has to be a screen where patients have that, you said it, where patients have that optionality on how they want to participate. And if the definition of a site changes, there'll be some will go direct to patient. I think in most interventional clinical trials, phase 2, phase 3 trials that are leading toward a drug approval, you have to see the patient at some point. It's just that now you don't have to go every week, every 2 weeks when you're driving an hour and a half to the big city. So the hypothesis is to, and this involves how sites change as well, but the hypothesis around DCT, I think, is to improve patient recruitment, to find more patients where they are, to improve the diversity of the patients that participate or choose to participate, and to get to them in better ways.
Sure.
If we spend money, because DCT is definitely not going to be cheaper in the beginning, but it would save money in the longer, bigger term. But the individual budget lines are probably going to go up, right? If we spend money to get to those places, to find patients where they are, to make it easier for them to find a trial, easier for them to enroll and stay in the trial, enroll and participate in the trial, engaged, and then stay in the whole trial and not drop out, then we will improve our diversity numbers pre-approval, which will make regulators happy, and the drug would actually be tested on more types of people in the beginning, which will help the commercial side. Patients won't drop out, which means we'll be able to use more data from patients in the stats side, which means the way they power their studies and they assume they have to drop a certain amount of patients, they will say, oh, we don't have to do that, which means we can finish the trial early, which means they get to market earlier, as opposed to the usual, which is we have 500 patients, 300 patients we get a drop because their data's crap. We need to spin up another 20 more sites, and it's going to take another 9 months. And out of those 20 sites, 8 of them are not going to find a single patient. And so the other, right. So you know how this snowballs, right? And so the hypothesis is decentralized trials will eventually improve the ROI. At Medable, we did a whole study with Ken Getz at Tufts. So it's called this net present value. It's another number you could use. But the idea is that you will have cost savings, you'll have time reduction, which equals more cost savings and equals higher satisfaction rates from patients that want to get involved, perhaps ones that never were able to get involved before because of the perception of it, but also that it was a pain in the neck to their life, even if it was a good choice, right? And so the way sites participate in that, there will be some sites, I think, where, I'm going to go there for the interim visits, but I might go into the city for the beginning, the middle, and the end. And then in between, it'll be a televisit. I might go to CVS to pick up some drugs. I might have some stuff shipped to my house. There'll be these options. So what if you had this optionality-based screen where the patient says, okay, the next 5 visits coming up, here are the windows you can schedule them in. Do you want them to be on site? Do you want them to be remote? Do you want someone to come to your house? Do you want this? And any of those services that are turned on, the software in the screen user experience that the patient would see would change based on what is available for that study.
Sure.
And we would, in the protocol, state which ones are actually available for those visits, because you can't just pick willy-nilly. You have to plan for it, right? You just give the patient the choice. Today, that sounds great for a patient, but how do you manage that at a site, at a sponsor?
Well, yeah, that was my next question is like, who's responsible for that? I mean, a PI ultimately still has to have oversight and responsibility for what happens in these trials. So yeah, that gets to be incredibly challenging if you're sort of liaisoning all these different customized journeys for each patient throughout their trial. So yeah, how does that, I mean, or is that how sites change? As they become more true coordinators, like liaisons through how that,
like patient navigators, I've heard the term. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Well, and again, even, I mean, coordinator is still a pretty appropriate term. I think, you're coordinating that whole journey with that patient. But again, that sounds, sounds like a lot. That's a lot of stuff to keep up with, right?
Yeah. I just think that, I mean, less than 4% of the population out there right now is eligible to even, or less than 4% of the population that is eligible to participate in a trial ever even gets access to the trial at all. And so right now, that means traditional trial sample sizes that are driven by biostats teams don't reflect the full scope of the actual suffering populations of some disease, right? Which ultimately undermines the safety and efficacy of trials and snowballs into this thing that after the drug's approved, you find issues and things like that. So there's no excuse for not having a better grasp on which drugs work for which patients. That's the ultimate goal of this. So the right thing to do, does it make business sense? And that's the big question.
Well, I mean, that could go for the whole entirety of pharma, right?
Yeah.
If you want to get crazy, oftentimes the right thing to do is not, the best financial one. And I think we often know which way the wind blows, unfortunately.
Especially when times get tough. And I mean, but the good news I've seen is that in my 20 years of working in this industry, every time, and I've been through, I guess, three different times. When I first started, 2002, .com bust, right? 2008, the housing crisis and the whole madness. And I would say now is happening. The next I don't know if I consider now a technical recession. It should be, but it's not. Pharma restructures. They unfortunately lay off people. They restructure the company. They reprioritize their assets and their pipelines, and they look to make things more efficient. And the tech companies that are supporting pharma always grow like crazy when this happens. It happened every time. And so job security is pretty good for most of the tech companies.
Well, yeah, I was curious about that. Like, does the sort of current market conditions affect like DCT in so much as, I mean, a lot of these companies are funded, these DCT vendors are funded by, VC or private equity, right? And market's not exactly beautiful shape. Does that put pressure on these companies? And if so, does that set back the DCT movement in any way?
I think it definitely puts pressure, for sure. I mean, no startup in growth mode would be immune to that. I think that there's every one of the companies that you see and hear about are going to go through some of that for sure, and reprioritize and have a line toward profitability and things like that, right? However, that is the time when a lot of their clients are more, desperate's not the right word, but more willing to buy and take a risk and build something together because they have more strict goals on their side. So it kind of benefits at the same time. So the trick then is, can you build stuff fast enough? And can you put out the right products with the right kind of feedback and empower your teams to listen to your clients and build the right thing? So that's a trick that I think the best companies get right? So I'm pretty excited. Again, I mentioned it's kind of like deja vu again when it comes to, it feels like 2010. I really think that's happening.
Sure.
It's happening again. There are trends we can learn. There are things that we can see that worked well and mistakes that we can avoid that happened before. So I'm pretty excited about it. I mean, I'm up for always from my career and in the companies that I worked for and whatnot, especially like today at Medable, right? We're trying to change everything about clinical development. We've all been trying to do this for years, right? But like improving, I like this analogy, right? You think about diversity and decentralization. So we're trying to change the scope of trials by improving the faces, the places, and the pace of the traditional trial models of today. And just, it doesn't have to be complete rip and replace. And in fact, decentralized trials is not an all or nothing thing. And you're going to see that, in slow bits, we're going to start to turn on new things and they're going to start to be adopted more. And then we'll move on to the next thing and then they'll start to consolidate. And from the site's perspective, I think that you're going to see differences in the technology you use, both that's given to you from sponsors and that you're going to use yourself for your own purposes without the sponsor asking you. You probably will see, I see lots of discussion what you have around, the biggest thing with sites is clinical trial contracts, payments, right? Christine Pierre from SCRS always said in like every talk I ever went to, she always snuck it in. It was pay your sites on time and pay your sites monthly, right? Which is like the beating of the drum support, right? And I would say, is that still an issue from your side? Is this still? It still is. Yeah.
We're literally, we are talking to a sponsor today that says we can't pay any more often than quarterly. I said, that's cool. How often do you get your paycheck? Is it quarterly? No, it's not. Okay. Well, you're going to pay us monthly. No, it's still a problem, very much, unfortunately.
And is accuracy still a problem too? Like you get paid, but is it right?
No, still a problem. I can't tell you how many times I could just open a bank account and see that there's money that's been placed there by a CRO, and I have no idea who's paid me for what study and for what patients. It's a mess. It's still very, very chaotic in that regard.
Let me ask you a payments question. I'm just curious myself. When I was in pharma, companies that I worked for and other companies also told me stories of payments. So this is for patient payments, not so much site payments. Site payments, I think, were being automated, and a lot of projects were ongoing for the right reasons. And the reason that they pay infrequently is because the process is so manual and so messed up that it takes them that long to figure. It's not so much a float thing, although talk to the CROs about that one.
Sure.
But the process is manual, so that gets better. But for patient payments, I heard stories about systems being turned on, and there's not too many patient payment solutions out there, so there's a few of them that they were turned on, deployed to sites. The cards are on site, the activation and the fees are being charged, and not a single site was using it for the entire trial being live. And then my question was, how are sites paying their patients if the solution that was provided to them is not being used? Do you know?
So we will use.
How is that even possible?
Yeah, we like to manage our own through our CTMS. That way we have.
So you pay patients directly through your CTMS?
Yep, we got a nice little reloadable Visa card. We assign it to the patient. They keep it throughout the course of the trial. We just reload it at every visit as they come in. It's not much different than using like a Greenfire, but it's integrated within our CTMS. I've worked at places where they will they'll mail a check quarterly out to all of their patients, or even cut a check day of. So again, depending on, I guess, how sophisticated your site is, you could either be like literally writing a check. When I first started and I didn't have CTMS or I didn't have all the bells and whistles, I hand wrote a check and handed it to the patient. And not the most sophisticated way to do things, but for better or worse, that's a part of I think a good practice in helping retain your patients is making sure they're paid that day,
When I was in a clinical trial in probably 2006 in Raleigh, North Carolina, I was paid in American Express gift checks. And take a guess of who accepts American Express gift checks.
Nobody?
Nobody except Starbucks. They would take it.
Nice.
And so I'd get a coffee and then I'd get change.
Right.
But like literally nobody would take them. Or I'd have to go to a bank, I guess.
Sure.
It was the most inconvenient thing ever, but that's all they had, right? That's all they gave you.
Sure.
And so you pay the patients yourselves and then you just invoice the sponsors through that process?
Yeah, or it's included.
Have you been given a Greenfire solution, for example, and then just not used it?
We have,
Or,
yeah.
Wow.
Again, since we already have put the patient into our CTMS, again, it keeps. I'd rather be able to track all of those payments myself in one place rather than have them spread out across other systems that I may or may not have access to later. The patient's telling me they haven't been paid. At least I can see what's going on. I can handle it, directly myself. I don't have to go through yet another third party. And again, I think it's just a good mechanism to ensure I've got access to knowing who's been paid versus it being on another, external system at that point.
And do you have sponsors that ask you, we want you to use our system, not yours?
No, they're usually pretty cool with whatever we decide, and we're happy to just say, we'd rather opt out and just pay ourselves. So yeah, usually that's not been a problem.
Imagine a world where you could do that for other solutions and other systems, where you could say, we're set, we're good, and there's a standard way to interface. So your standard way with payments is I invoice you, you receive it, I get paid. Now you don't get paid as often as you want. That's a problem.
Right.
But there's a way to manage it.
Sure.
And for other systems, that's this interoperability between sites and sponsors needs to improve, and other systems I think will follow.
Yeah, no, you're right. And I think part of that is just having these conversations, because I don't think, again, I don't see it that much publicly, right? I've talked about this before, but like I envy in a way how DTRA can get together and a bunch of competitors can talk about decentralized trials together.
It is great.
And you don't see that as much in other parts, in the industry. And even, I guess, again, you've got things like SCRS. Now I've got my own opinions, keep to myself, but I think there should be more open and transparent collaboration so that, look, DCT they're going to make progress and they're going to have their shit sorted, and sites aren't. We're going to be left in the same position to say, okay, tell us what to do and we'll do it. And that's what I'm a little bit afraid of when it comes to the bigger landscape of clinical trial sites, if that makes sense.
So the Decentralized Trials Research Alliance, DTRA, that annual meeting is November 7th in Boston. Are you coming?
I don't know, honestly. Do they do that in CNS like at the same time, or are those different?
Last year they did. This year they're not. So the November 7th is DTRA at it's at the Encore Casino in Boston, the new one they built, which is great. And then the CNS Summit, which is probably my favorite event of the year, is November 17th, I believe, in Boca Raton.
Yeah, that sounds right. I'm shooting for CNS. I'm not so sure about DTRA, but
well, either way, I'd love to hopefully see you there in person. Maybe we can organize some kind of a panel or something, whether I'm with it or there's other people that are organizing it. I want to be involved, because this is a great conversation to have that would be cross-functional. I mean, the voice of the site is so important into the future of what decentralized trials become. And hell, maybe in 5 or 8 years, we won't even call it decentralized trials anymore. We'll just call it trials.
Yeah, no, I think that's probably going to be the case. I mean, it's coming. It's just again, I think it's important that sites' voices are involved as much as they can be, because I think it'll ultimately serve patients better as well. I mean, that's what we're doing here, right?
Agree. Well, hey, I appreciate you just being a voice.
Sure. No, hey, I'm going to be a voice. Whether it's a good or bad one remains to be seen. But either way, I'll be a voice. I'd say I know you've got a heart out. Where can people find you online?
Yeah, so a few places. Obviously, you find me on LinkedIn, Joe Dustin. You can. I have a website. I've had it for years, but joedustin.com has a whole bunch of stuff and links that you can go to, which is kind of fun. And then Twitter. In the early days of Twitter, I was able to nab the Twitter handle at eClinical. So
nice.
You can.
No one's tried to buy that off of you yet.
Try it. Go for it. But when I retire, I'll sell it, I guess. We'll see.
There you go. Joe, I really appreciate you coming on, man. And probably to be continued. I think we still only scratched the surface of a couple issues, and probably could go a lot deeper on some of this.
Yeah. For sure. Anytime, Brad. I appreciate the time, and keep doing what you're doing.
That's what it's all about. Thanks, Joe. As always, thank you so much for listening to the Note to File podcast. Make sure to check us out at notetofilepodcast.com for show notes, episode transcripts, and guest contact information. Thank you.